The judgment that changed everything. The heavy wooden gavel cracked through the morning air like thunder, making several people in the courtroom jump. Judge Evelyn Monroe barely glanced up as she delivered her ruling, her voice as sharp and cold as winter frost. 6 months in county jail. Next case. The young man at the defendant's table seemed to shrink into himself, his shoulders hunching forward as if to shield against the weight of her words. His public defender patted his arm awkwardly before gathering his worn briefcase and scattered documents. Officer Greg Harris, a veteran of Monroe's courtroom, led the defendant away with firm but gentle hands. As he passed the court reporter's desk, Greg caught a hushed conversation between two longtime staff members. "She used to be different, you know," one whispered. "Before her son died. Smiled more. Actually talked to people." "How long ago was that now?" 3 years? The other murmured back. "Yeah, this spring. Poor woman hasn't been the same since." Greg nodded as he walked past, his expression heavy with remembrance. He'd been there at the funeral, a small gray affair that matched the rain-soaked sky. Judge Monroe had stood like a statue, her face unreadable, her grief locked away behind an iron will. 2 days later, she had returned to the courtroom, her demeanor colder than ever, her compassion buried alongside her son. But Evelyn Monroe didn't acknowledge the whispers. She never did. Her fingers, adorned with a simple gold wedding band that no longer carried the weight of a marriage, moved with precise efficiency as she opened the next case file. Her steel-gray eyes, magnified by the lenses perched on the edge of her nose, flicked over the details. Child custody hearing. Liam and Lucas Carter, age 5. A long, measured exhale left her lips. The sound carried no emotion. Just another breath, just another case, just another decision to be made in an endless stream of human problems. The courtroom emptied slowly, the shuffle of feet and rustle of papers fading into silence. Judge Monroe leaned back in her high-backed leather chair, pressing her fingers against her temples where a familiar ache was building. The morning's fluorescent lights reflected off the polished wooden surfaces, already grating on her senses. Quick footsteps approached from her left, the familiar click-clack of sensible heels belonging to Patricia Reed, her court clerk of 15 years. A steaming cup of black coffee appeared at her elbow. The rich aroma filled the air between them. "You've been at this since 7 a.m., Patricia said softly, her round face creased with concern. "You should take a break. Breaks are for people who let emotion interfere with judgment." "I don't," Monroe replied without looking up. Patricia's sigh was barely audible as she retreated, leaving the judge alone with the Carter twins file. The pages told a story Monroe had seen too many times before. Parents. Deceased. A house fire last year. Foster homes. 3 in the past 12 months. Current placement. A group home. Her eyes lingered on the photographs clipped to the file. 2 identical faces stared back at her. Dark hair, deep brown eyes, small features still round with baby softness. One boy's expression was guarded, protective. The other's was open, vulnerable. Something in her chest twinged. She pushed the feeling away, straightening the photos with precise movements. Judge Monroe had stopped believing she could fix the system long ago. There were too many cases, too many children, too many flaws in a machine that was supposed to protect the vulnerable, but often left them more wounded than before. She learned the hard way that caring too much only led to disappointment, or worse. The memory of her own loss threatened to surface, but she shoved it down with practiced efficiency. Taking a long sip of the coffee Patricia had brought, she straightened her shoulders beneath her black robe, her spine aligning with the tall chair behind her like a sword being returned to its scabbard. "Send them in," she called out, her voice carrying the same detached authority it had held all morning. The words echoed slightly in the nearly empty courtroom. The heavy courtroom doors began to open with a familiar creak, and Judge Monroe prepared herself for what was supposed to be just another custody hearing. Just another case to be decided with cool, impartial judgment. But something about those photographs nagged at her carefully maintained composure. like a loose thread threatening to unravel a tightly woven fabric. The heavy doors swung open, and all heads turned to watch as Melissa Grant, a social worker with dark circles under her eyes and a stack of worn folders tucked under her arm, guided two small figures into the room. The twin boys couldn't have been more than 5 years old, their tiny hands clasped together so tightly their knuckles had turned white. Their clothes were clearly hand-me-downs. One wore a faded blue sweater that hung past his fingertips, while the other's pants had a small tear at the knee. Judge Evelyn Monroe barely glanced up from her papers, her reading glasses perched on the edge of her nose. "State the case," she commanded, her voice maintaining its practiced detachment. Melissa shifted her weight from one sensible shoe to the other, speaking in the tired tone of someone who had given this speech too many times before. Liam and Lucas Carter, age 5. Parents died in a house fire last year. They've been through 3 foster homes and are currently in the Golden Grove group home. The last placement ended when the foster parents separated, Melissa added, glancing at the boys. "And your recommendation?" Monroe asked, still not looking at the children. "We recommend maintaining their current placement, Your Honor, at least until we can find something more suitable." Now Monroe did look up, her eyebrow arching as she removed her glasses. "The same placement that has multiple complaints of neglect on file, including reports of children going hungry." Melissa's professional facade cracked slightly as she shifted uncomfortably, clutching her folders closer to her chest. "We're severely understaffed, Your Honor. Resources are limited, and our waiting list for foster families grows longer every day. We're doing the best we can with what we have." Monroe's jaw clenched. The same excuse, over and over again. She forced herself to look at the twins. They stood close together, their shoulders touching, their wide brown eyes darting around the courtroom, taking in the towering ceiling, the heavy wooden furniture, the stern-faced adults in their formal attire. Then, suddenly, one of them broke away from his brother's grip. His worn sneakers squeaked against the polished floor. Before anyone could react, he darted forward, his small hand reaching out to grasp the bottom of Monroe's black robe, the fabric bunching in his tiny fist. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Can you be our new mommy?" The courtroom fell silent. The air seemed to thicken, pressing down on Monroe's chest. She stared down at the little boy, Liam. She realized from the small crescent-shaped birthmark near his ear. His brown eyes looked up at her with a mixture of hope and fear. Behind him, Lucas took a hesitant step forward, his own eyes filling with tears. Judge Monroe's fingers tightened around her gavel until her knuckles turned white. Something deep inside her began to crack. Cracks in the walls. The courtroom remained frozen in a stunned silence. Judge Evelyn Monroe, known for her unshakable demeanor and ice-cold rulings, stared down at the small boy who had just shattered every ounce of her carefully crafted detachment. "Can you be our new mommy?" The words echoed in her mind, ricocheting off the steel walls she had spent years fortifying around her heart. Liam's tiny hand remained clenched in the fabric of her robe, his knuckles pale with the force of his grip. Behind him, Lucas stood motionless, his eyes brimming with unused tears. The desperation in their faces made something deep within her chest ache, a feeling she had long thought buried. Evelyn willed herself to breathe. This was not part of the procedure. This was not how the law worked. She forced her lips into a firm line and gently pried Liam's fingers from her robe. His small hand trembled as it fell back to his side. "I am not a candidate for guardianship," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "This is a legal proceeding." Liam's lower lip quivered. His small chest rose and fell in uneven breaths, as though he were struggling to keep from breaking apart. "But we don't want to go back," Lucas whispered. The pain in his voice cut deeper than Evelyn expected. A soft shuffle of papers reminded her that the courtroom was still full of people, staff, the bailiff, and most notably, Melissa Grant, who cleared her throat awkwardly. "Your Honor," Melissa started, stepping forward. "If we could continue." But Evelyn wasn't listening. Her gaze was fixed on Liam and Lucas, Something about the way they stood there, clutching each other like they were the last two people left in the world, struck her in a place she had locked away for 15 years. Samuel used to stand like that. Her son, her beautiful golden-haired boy. She had once taken him for granted, assuming there would always be another bedtime story, another morning hug, another day. And then, there wasn't. Her hands tightened around the gavel. She couldn't afford to feel this way. Not again. She inhaled sharply, forcing steel back into her voice. "I am postponing my ruling," she announced, surprising even herself. Melissa's eyes snapped up in alarm. "Your Honor, I want a full report on their current placement by tomorrow morning." Evelyn's voice brooked no argument, "and I expect a thorough investigation into the complaints against the Golden Grove group home. This hearing is suspended until further notice." The gavel came down with a sharp crack. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Melissa's mouth opened as if to protest, but one look at Evelyn's face silenced her. The bailiff nodded in quiet approval. Lucas wiped his eyes on his oversized sweater while Liam stared at her, just stared, like he was trying to understand something he had never seen before. Hope. Later that night, the heavy front door clicked shut behind Evelyn as she stepped into her dimly lit house. The silence wrapped around her like a suffocating blanket, broken only by the steady tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Her heels made a soft thud as she slipped them off, leaving them neatly aligned by the door. The house was immaculate, just as she liked it, just as she needed it. Everything was exactly where it should be. Controlled, orderly, predictable. But as she walked toward the kitchen, the stillness of the house felt different. It felt empty. She poured herself a glass of wine, swirling the dark liquid in slow circles. "Can you be our new mommy?" The memory struck her like a hammer to the ribs. Evelyn exhaled shakily, setting the glass down before she broke it. It had been years since anyone had called her mommy. She used to hear it every day, the sound of tiny feet running down the hallway, the soft whisper of a bedtime story, the warmth of a little boy curling into her side when he had a bad dream. But that little boy was gone. Her hand shook as she reached for the cabinet above the sink, pulling down a worn shoebox. She hadn't touched it in years. Dust had gathered on the lid, and she wiped it away with trembling fingers. Inside, protected by yellowing tissue paper, was a single photograph. Samuel. His bright blue eyes shone with mischief, his blonde curls slightly messy. A gap-toothed smile stretched across his face, the same smile he had given her the morning of the accident. "Love you, Mommy." Evelyn sucked in a sharp breath. Her fingers curled around the photograph, gripping it like a lifeline. "I can't do this again." She would not allow herself to care. Caring led to pain. Caring meant losing. But then, why couldn't she stop thinking about two little boys with pleading eyes and trembling lips? Why couldn't she stop hearing those words? "Can you be our new mommy?" The next day, a broken system. Evelyn's silver BMW rolled to a stop outside the Golden Grove group home. The building was in worse condition than she expected. Paint peeled from the wooden siding in long strips, and dark stains marked the areas where rain had seeped through the roof. The lawn was overgrown, weeds pushing through the cracked sidewalk like fingers reaching for escape. As she stepped out of her car, a sharp gust of wind sent dead leaves swirling around her feet. The air smelled wrong. It wasn't just the mildew or the faint stench of cigarette smoke clinging to the walls. It was the emptiness. The kind of silence that suffocated. She knocked once, twice. The door creaked open to reveal a tired-looking woman in a stained cardigan. Cynthia Marsh, the group home director. "Didn't expect a judge to come knocking unannounced," Cynthia muttered, her arms crossing defensively over her chest. "I need to see Liam and Lucas Carter," Evelyn said coolly, stepping past her into the dimly lit hallway. The inside was no better than the outside. The furniture was mismatched and stained, the walls bore scuff marks, and the air carried the unmistakable scent of neglect. Evelyn's jaw tightened. A child, no older than 4, sat on the threadbare carpet, staring blankly at a cracked television screen. Another shuffled past the kitchen, his clothes too small for his thin frame. This was no home. This was survival. Cynthia led her upstairs, each step groaning under their weight. When they reached the small bedroom, Evelyn felt something twist in her gut. Liam and Lucas sat on a single sagging bed, their tiny bodies pressed close together. Their faces were pale, their eyes hollow. Lucas had dried tear tracks on his cheeks, but it was Liam who made her freeze. Dark bruises wrapped around his upper arm, small, purple fingerprints marring his delicate skin. Evelyn's stomach dropped. "Where did you get that?" she asked, kneeling to meet Liam's eyes. The boy flinched. His gaze darted to Cynthia before fixing on the floor. Lucas clutched his brother's sleeve. A soft, trembling whisper filled the room. "Please don't leave us here." The plea sent a chill down Evelyn's spine. A burning rage flared inside her, cold, controlled, but lethal. This was not just another case. This was not just another ruling. These were her boys now. And she would fight for them, even if it meant breaking the law she had sworn to uphold. A battle begins. The drive back to her chambers was silent. The city lights flickered past in a blur, but Evelyn Monroe's mind wasn't on the road. It was still inside that dark, suffocating group home. "Please don't leave us here." Lucas's whisper rang in her ears, intertwining with the quiet, desperate way Liam had clutched his brother's sleeve, shielding him the best he could from a world that had already failed them. Then there were the bruises. Evelyn had spent years training herself not to react emotionally in the courtroom, but the sight of those dark, hand-shaped marks on Liam's fragile arm had made her stomach twist with rage. She had wanted to demand answers, to tear through every locked door in that house, until she found out exactly who had done this. But she had restrained herself, because restraint was what the law required. But now, as she pulled into the courthouse parking lot, her hands clenched the steering wheel with white-knuckled force. For the first time in her career, the law didn't feel like enough. Breaking the chains of protocol. The moment Evelyn stepped into her chambers, Patricia was waiting. Her clerk of 15 years immediately noticed the tension in her boss's shoulders, the hard set of her jaw. "Rough visit?" Patricia asked cautiously. Evelyn tossed the Carter twins case file onto her desk. "Worse." Patricia took one look at her boss's stormy expression and shut the office door. "Tell me." Evelyn exhaled sharply, rubbing her temples. "That group home is worse than the reports say. The conditions are atrocious, but the bruises..." Her voice faltered. Liam had finger-shaped bruises on his arm. Patricia's mouth tightened. "Neglect is one thing. Physical abuse is another. I need leverage." Evelyn's voice was low but firm, something that forces the state's hand to remove them immediately. Patricia hesitated. "Evelyn, if you push this without undeniable proof, they'll stonewall you. Social services will delay action. You know how the system works." "I don't care," Evelyn snapped. "I'm not waiting for another official investigation while those boys suffer." Patricia studied her for a long moment. "You're personally invested in this case." Evelyn met her gaze. "I am." The words hung in the air. There was no use denying it. Patricia sighed, rubbing her forehead. "All right. Then we need to do this right. You can't just throw accusations. You need a case strong enough to hold up against the entire department." Evelyn nodded. "Then let's get to work." A system that fails the innocent. By morning, they had gathered everything they could. Patricia had pulled every complaint lodged against the Golden Grove group home in the past 5 years. The reports painted a horrifying picture. Malnourished children, missing medical records, lost incident reports of injuries. Every complaint had been buried under bureaucratic red tape. Each page felt like another dagger in Evelyn's heart. As she read through the statements, the same sick pattern repeated itself. Neglect, denial, cover-up. The system had ignored every single one. "They're protecting the home," Patricia muttered, flipping through another stack of documents. Someone is making sure none of this sticks. Evelyn's grip tightened on the file. Then we make it stick. An enemy in the shadows. By midday, Evelyn had requested an emergency hearing. It was a bold move, one that would draw scrutiny. She didn't care. As she stepped out of her office, she barely noticed the hushed murmurs from courthouse staff. The other judges stole glances at her, some in curiosity, others in concern. But she ignored them. She had a battle to fight. The moment she entered the courtroom, Melissa Grant was waiting for her. The social worker's usual tired, detached expression was gone, replaced by something closer to irritation. "Judge Monroe," Melissa said through gritted teeth, "this hearing is premature." "It's necessary," Evelyn shot back. "That group home is dangerous. I'm ordering an emergency removal for the Carter twins." Melissa sighed. "You don't have authority to." "I have the authority to ensure a child's safety." Evelyn's voice was calm, but there was an edge of steel beneath it. "And I have evidence." She pushed a thick folder across the table. Melissa hesitated before flipping through it, her brows furrowed as she scanned the documents. Finally, she closed the file and pinched the bridge of her nose. "Damn it," she muttered under her breath. Evelyn crossed her arms. "So you do see the problem." Melissa set the folder down. "Judge Monroe, do you realize how many kids we're already trying to place? There isn't an easy solution here. I'm not looking for an easy solution. I'm looking for justice." Melissa exhaled, rubbing her forehead. "Fine, but I need time. You have 24 hours. Melissa opened her mouth to argue, but one look at Evelyn's face made her stop. For the first time, she seemed to realize that Judge Monroe was not backing down. Melissa muttered a curse under her breath and stormed out. Evelyn watched her go, her hands clenching at her sides. She had made an enemy today, but it was a price she was willing to pay. Threats in the dark. That evening, Evelyn sat in her dimly lit office, the soft glow of her desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. The clock ticked steadily. She was reviewing legal precedents when her office phone rang. She hesitated. Something in her gut told her this was not a normal call. Slowly, she picked up the receiver. "Judge Monroe speaking." A low, measured voice answered. "Judge, you're making waves in places you shouldn't." Evelyn's grip on the phone tightened. The voice was smooth, calculated, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who wasn't used to being questioned. "Who is this?" she asked, her tone cold. "Someone who respects the law. Someone who doesn't want to see your career go up in flames because of 2 foster kids." Her stomach twisted. She had expected resistance. But this was a warning. "If you keep pushing, you'll find yourself at the center of an ethics complaint," the voice continued. "Maybe even an investigation." Evelyn exhaled slowly. She had spent years building her reputation. They were trying to use it against her. She forced a small, humorless smile. "You think you can scare me?" "I think I'm giving you options," the voice replied. "Drop the case. Go back to the way things were. A pause. Or watch everything you've built burn." The line went dead. Evelyn slowly placed the receiver back in its cradle. She sat in silence, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. They were trying to make her afraid. It almost worked. Almost. But then she thought of Liam's bruises, Lucas's whispered plea. "Please don't leave us here." Evelyn stood up, her pulse steadying, her resolve turning into something harder than steel. The system had failed them, but she wouldn't, even if it cost her everything. Fighting fire with fire. The threat lingered in Evelyn Monroe's mind long after the phone call had ended. She could still hear the voice, low, cold, and confident, offering her a choice. Drop the case, or watch everything you've built burn. It was a direct warning. But it was also a mistake, because whoever was behind this had assumed she would choose herself over 2 little boys with nowhere else to turn. They were wrong. She had spent her career upholding the law, protecting the vulnerable, ensuring justice was served. But what she had seen in that group home, what she had felt when Liam and Lucas looked up at her with fear in their eyes, was more than just another case. It was personal now. And Evelyn Monroe was ready for war. A dangerous discovery. By morning, Patricia had tracked down more information about the Golden Grove group home. "What I found isn't just bad," Patricia said, dropping a thick manila folder onto Evelyn's desk. "It's criminal." Evelyn flipped open the folder, scanning through financial records, employee files, and incident reports. Her stomach twisted. The home had been receiving state funding for over double the number of children actually housed there. The official records listed 27 children in care, but their most recent inspections only accounted for 14. The rest, ghosts. "There's money being funneled somewhere," Patricia muttered. I cross-referenced the director's personal accounts. Large cash deposits every month, way beyond what her salary should be. "Someone's pocketing state funds," Evelyn murmured. "And they're covering their tracks by rotating kids in and out of the home," Patricia added. "That's why Liam and Lucas have bounced between so many places. They move kids around just enough to avoid scrutiny." Evelyn's jaw tightened. This wasn't just negligence. This was corruption. "This goes beyond child welfare," Evelyn said, tapping her finger on the documents. "This is fraud." Patricia nodded. "If you take this to the DA, it won't just shut down Golden Grove. It'll open an entire investigation into how deep this runs." Evelyn closed the folder, the weight of what she had just uncovered pressed heavily on her chest. She had the ammunition she needed. Now she just had to use it before whoever had called her the night before found a way to stop her. A play for power. The moment Evelyn arrived at the courthouse, Leonard Graves was waiting for her. Graves was the director of Child Welfare Services, and more importantly, the man who had allowed the system to fail. His neatly pressed suit and polished smile screamed politics, but Evelyn wasn't in the mood for diplomacy. "Judge Monroe," he greeted, spreading his arms like they were old friends. "I heard you've been taking an interest in the Carter twins." Evelyn crossed her arms. "Cut the pleasantries, Leonard." His smile barely faltered. "You've always been sharp. That's why I came to you personally." He leaned in slightly, voice lowering. "You're making a mistake." Evelyn met his gaze without flinching. The only mistake would be letting those boys suffer in that home for one more day. Graves sighed, shaking his head. "You don't understand how complicated these cases are." "I understand exactly how they work," Evelyn interrupted, voice cold. "I also understand that Golden Grove has been stealing money from the state, moving children like chess pieces to keep the fraud going." For the first time, Graves's confidence wavered. She saw the slight twitch of his jaw. He knew. Evelyn took a slow step forward, her heels clicking against the polished floor. "I have proof, Leonard. Financial records, fake reports, and I'm taking it to the district attorney." His expression hardened. "You're stepping out of line, Evelyn." "No," she said, voice sharp as steel. "You are, and it's over." Graves exhaled through his nose, his mask of charm completely gone now. "If you do this, you'll be making powerful enemies. I already have." He studied her for a long moment, then smiled again. But this time, it was something else. Resignation. "Good luck, Judge Monroe," he said smoothly, stepping back. "I hope you know what you're getting into." Evelyn watched him walk away. Then she turned and strode straight to the DA's office. It was time to end this. The breaking point. It took less than 24 hours for the fallout to begin. That evening, the district attorney authorized an immediate emergency raid on Golden Grove. Evelyn wasn't there when it happened. She wasn't allowed to be, but she read the report as soon as it came across her desk. The group home director, Cynthia Marsh, had been arrested. Social workers had removed all 14 children still in the home, including Liam and Lucas. They were safe. For now. But Evelyn knew the battle wasn't over. Because Graves, and whoever had been backing him, would retaliate. She just didn't know how soon. The unexpected blow. The next morning, Patricia stormed into Evelyn's office, her face pale. "They're coming after you," she said breathlessly. Evelyn's brows furrowed. "Who?" Patricia slammed a document onto the desk. It was a formal complaint. Against her. Leonard Graves filed a motion questioning your ethical conduct in handling the Carter twins case, Patricia said, voice shaking with fury. "He's claiming you acted with personal bias, that you overstepped your authority." Evelyn's stomach clenched. "They're trying to disqualify you from any future decisions regarding the boys," Patricia continued. "If this goes through, they'll assign the case to a different judge, someone they can control." Evelyn's breath came slow and measured, but inside, she was burning. They were trying to take the boys away. Not because it was right, not because it was just, but because she had exposed their corruption. They wanted revenge. She stood up slowly, smoothing down her judicial robe. "Who's handling the complaint?" Patricia hesitated. "Judge Harrison." Evelyn nodded. Judge Richard Harrison was a respected judge. More importantly, he was fair, which meant there was still a chance. But Evelyn knew this wasn't just about defending her own name. This was about protecting Liam and Lucas, because if she lost this battle, if she was removed from the case, then she had no doubt that Graves and his allies would do everything in their power to make sure those boys disappeared into the system, and she would never see them again. The night before the fight, Evelyn sat at her kitchen table that night, unable to sleep. She had been through dozens of legal battles, but none had ever felt this personal. A soft knock at the front door startled her. She opened it to find Margaret Walker standing on the porch, wrapped in a light sweater. Behind her, standing side by side in matching pajamas, were Liam and Lucas. Evelyn's chest tightened. "We didn't want to sleep without saying goodnight," Lucas whispered. Evelyn knelt down, her eyes burning with unshed tears. "Come here." The boys ran into her arms. Liam clutched her sleeve, his tiny fingers tightening like he was afraid she'd slip away. "Are we gonna have to go back?" he whispered against her shoulder. Evelyn swallowed hard, pressing a kiss to his hair. "No," she promised. She had never meant anything more in her life. The battle for justice. Evelyn Monroe barely slept that night. The memory of Liam and Lucas standing at her door, their small bodies trembling with uncertainty, haunted her like a specter. She had spent years building her career, priding herself on her ability to remain impartial, logical, and emotionally detached. And now she was standing on the edge of losing everything: her reputation, her career, her ability to protect those boys, because she had dared to go against a broken system. But if they thought she would back down, they had gravely underestimated her. The ethics hearing. A courtroom turned battlefield. The next morning, Evelyn entered the courthouse knowing she was walking into an ambush. The ethics hearing was scheduled in Judge Harrison's chambers, a private proceeding away from the public eye. But even though the room wasn't packed with onlookers, Evelyn could feel the weight of the watching eyes. Leonard Graves was already seated when she arrived. His lawyer, James Mitchell, adjusted his tie and smiled at her, a snake's smile, full of confidence that she would lose. Judge Harrison, an older man with sharp eyes and a steady hand, shuffled his papers before looking up. "We are here to address the motion filed against Judge Monroe," Harrison began, his deep voice filling the room. "Mr. Graves, you claim Judge Monroe acted unethically in her handling of the Carter twins case." "Yes, Your Honor," Graves said smoothly. "Judge Monroe personally intervened in an active child welfare case, overstepped her jurisdiction, and displayed clear bias in favor of 2 minors." Evelyn didn't flinch even as Graves continued. "She personally investigated the conditions of a state-licensed group home," he went on, "filed an emergency motion without due process, and overstepped her role as a neutral judicial officer." Judge Harrison nodded, tapping his pen against his desk. And you believe her involvement was inappropriate. Graves gave a sympathetic sigh. Your Honor, we all respect Judge Monroe's years of service. But judges cannot make emotional decisions. They must remain impartial, or else the integrity of the court is compromised. Evelyn's jaw tightened. She had expected this tactic. They were framing her as an emotional woman who had let her feelings override her duty. She waited until Graves finished his polished, manipulative speech. Then she stood. Your Honor, Evelyn began, her voice unwavering. I acted within the scope of my judicial authority. When a case presents credible evidence of child abuse, it is my responsibility to ensure those children are protected. Judge Harrison leaned back slightly. And you believe that's what happened here? Evelyn reached into her bag and pulled out a thick folder. I don't just believe it, she said, placing it on the judge's desk. I know it. Harrison opened the folder, his sharp eyes scanning the contents. Inside were copies of every falsified report from the Golden Grove group home. Financial discrepancies proving state funds had been stolen, and medical records documenting Liam's bruises. Graves's lawyer, James Mitchell, stiffened. Graves's smirk flickered. Judge Harrison flipped through the pages slowly. The room remained silent, the air thick with tension. Finally, he looked up. This is troubling. Evelyn nodded. That's because it's a cover-up. She turned her gaze to Graves, her voice dripping with quiet fury. Mr. Graves is accusing me of overstepping because I exposed the corruption that he allowed to happen. Graves's lawyer shot up from his seat. Objection. This is not a trial, Mr. Mitchell. Judge Harrison cut him off with a sharp glance. Sit down. Mitchell sat, his face red with frustration. Graves, however, kept his composure. Your Honor, regardless of these allegations, Judge Monroe's personal involvement in this case remains a clear conflict of interest. Evelyn arched an eyebrow. Conflict of interest. Or the only reason those boys aren't still in a home that was profiting off neglect. Graves clenched his jaw. Judge Harrison closed the file and folded his hands. Judge Monroe, do you regret your actions? Evelyn straightened her shoulders. No, Your Honor. I regret that I didn't act sooner. Silence. A long, heavy silence. Then, Harrison sighed. I see no evidence that Judge Monroe acted unethically, he declared. Rather, I see a judge who refused to turn a blind eye. Motion for disqualification denied. Evelyn didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. Because she had won. But the war wasn't over yet. The aftermath. Graves makes his move. As the hearing ended, Graves stood up and straightened his tie. His face was smooth, unreadable. He met Evelyn's gaze with a carefully measured smirk. Congratulations, he said in a low voice. You just made yourself a target. Evelyn didn't blink. So did you. Graves chuckled, but there was no amusement in it. You think this is over? You think those boys are safe? He took a slow step forward. The system is bigger than you, Judge Monroe. I own the system. Evelyn's hands clenched at her sides. Not anymore. Graves gave a slight nod, like he was acknowledging an opponent who had played a good round. Then he walked away. Evelyn exhaled slowly, steadying herself. She had won the battle. But she had just declared war on a system that was willing to destroy children to protect itself, and she wasn't sure how much time she had before it retaliated. Returning to the boys. That evening, Evelyn drove straight to the Walker's house. She needed to see the boys. She needed to know they were safe. Margaret greeted her with a warm smile, stepping aside to let her in. They're in the backyard, she said softly. Evelyn followed the sound of laughter to find Liam and Lucas chasing fireflies across the grass. Their little hands reached out, giggling as the glowing insects danced around them. The sight made Evelyn's throat tighten. They looked happy. They looked like they belonged here. As if sensing her presence, Lucas turned, and his face lit up. Mommy, he shouted. Evelyn froze. The word hit her like a tidal wave. Liam ran up beside his brother, looking uncertain. "I mean, can we call you that?" he asked, fidgeting with his sleeve. Evelyn knelt down, her vision blurring with unused tears. "Yes," she whispered. "You can." Lucas flung himself into her arms, and Liam followed, their small bodies pressing into her. Evelyn held them close. She had won today's battle, but she would keep fighting for them, no matter the cost. The system strikes back. Evelyn Monroe had won the first battle, but the war was far from over. She had exposed the corruption behind Golden Grove, secured an emergency removal for Liam and Lucas, and beaten Leonard Graves in the ethics hearing. But she wasn't naive enough to believe that was the end of it. The system was a living, breathing machine, and like any beast cornered, it would lash out. She just didn't expect how quickly it would come for her. An unthinkable motion. 2 days after the ethics hearing, Patricia burst into Evelyn's office, her face pale. "They filed an appeal," Patricia said, slamming the document onto the desk. Evelyn grabbed it, her stomach sinking, as she read the words at the top of the page. Motion to reevaluate custody placement of Liam and Lucas Carter. Filed by Vanessa Carter. Liam and Lucas's biological aunt, a woman who had made no attempt to claim them when their parents died, a woman with a criminal history riddled with fraud and financial instability, was now suddenly demanding custody. Evelyn felt a cold fury coil inside her chest. "They didn't just get rid of Golden Grove," she muttered, her voice low and dangerous. "They found a new way to take the boys." Patricia nodded grimly. "Graves and his people are behind this, no question. They're using Vanessa as a loophole. If they can't keep the boys in the system, they'll push for a family reunification, knowing she'll be easier to manipulate." Evelyn clenched her jaw. Blood relatives had strong legal standing in custody cases. Even with Vanessa's history of fraud, the court might side with her under the argument that the boys should be raised by family, even if that family had abandoned them for over a year. "They want me to fight this," Evelyn realized. "They want me to exhaust my resources and lose credibility by pushing back." Patricia hesitated. "If they succeed, Vanessa gets custody. The boys will be taken from the Walkers and placed with a woman who sees them as a paycheck." Evelyn's grip on the paper tightened. "They think I'm going to let that happen." She stood, her voice sharp as a blade. "They're wrong." Unraveling Vanessa's lies. Evelyn had one advantage: time. The court had scheduled the custody hearing for the end of the week, which meant she had 3 days to dismantle Vanessa Carter's case before it even reached the judge's bench. 3 days to prove that this woman had no intention of caring for the boys. And that meant digging deeper. She made one phone call. "Delaney Investigations," a gruff voice answered. "Frank," Evelyn said. "It's Judge Monroe." A pause. Then a knowing sigh. "I take it you need dirt." "I need everything," she said. "Vanessa Carter. Financials, criminal records, any connections to Leonard Graves or his network." Frank clicked his tongue. "You never go after easy targets, do you?" "No," Evelyn said simply. "I don't." A desperate night. By evening, Evelyn was sitting in her car, parked outside the Walker's house. She hadn't intended to stop by, but her heart had led her here. She needed to see the boys. The house was warm, the smell of dinner still lingering in the air. Margaret ushered her inside, giving her a knowing smile. "They've been waiting for you," she said softly. Evelyn stepped into the living room, where Liam and Lucas sat curled up on the couch, a storybook open between them. At the sound of her footsteps, they both looked up. Lucas was the first to move. He launched himself at her, his small arms wrapping around her waist. "You came back," he whispered into her robe. Liam followed, standing just slightly behind. His face was cautious, unsure. Evelyn knelt, looking them both in the eye. "You are not going anywhere," she promised. "I need you to trust me, okay?" Lucas nodded immediately. Liam hesitated. even if they say we have to. Evelyn's throat tightened. No one is going to make you do anything. Liam studied her for a long moment, then finally nodded. Okay. They trusted her, and that was something Graves would never be able to take away. Frank Delaney delivers. The next morning, Evelyn's phone rang. Frank, I found your smoking gun, he said, his voice tinged with satisfaction. You're going to want to sit down for this. Evelyn grabbed a pen. Talk. Vanessa Carter's been making regular deposits into her bank account from an unknown source. Frank began. Big amounts, suspiciously right after she filed for custody. Evelyn's pulse quickened. Who's paying her? That's the interesting part. Frank continued. The deposits don't trace back to Leonard Graves directly, but they come from an LLC owned by one of his private donors. Evelyn's grip on the phone tightened. They're paying her to take custody of the boys. Bingo, Frank confirmed. They don't want her to actually raise them. They just want them out of your hands. Evelyn exhaled sharply. Send me everything. Already in your inbox. Frank said, just be careful, Monroe. Graves is playing dirty. Evelyn hung up. She stared at the email on her screen. Then she reached for her phone. Patricia, she said when her clerk answered. We're about to tear Vanessa Carter's case apart. The custody hearing. A final showdown. The courtroom was packed. Vanessa sat at the petitioner's table, her lawyer looking smug. Evelyn took her seat at the opposing table, flanked by Patricia and Margaret Walker. The boys sat quietly behind her. Judge Harrison entered, his face unreadable. We are here to determine the custody status of Liam and Lucas Carter. Vanessa's lawyer stood first. Your Honor, my client is the children's biological aunt. Blood relations should take priority in all custody proceedings. Judge Harrison nodded, then turned to Evelyn. Judge Monroe, you object. Evelyn rose, keeping her voice calm and controlled. Yes, Your Honor, because Miss Carter is not here for the welfare of these children. A murmur swept through the courtroom. Vanessa stiffened. That's a lie. Evelyn ignored her. Miss Carter has received multiple large deposits into her bank account, right after filing for custody. Gasps. Vanessa's lawyer shifted uncomfortably. That's circumstantial. Evelyn slid the bank statements onto the judge's desk. Judge Harrison flipped through the documents, his expression darkening. These funds came from a company owned by a political donor closely connected to Leonard Graves. Evelyn continued. Miss Carter has no intention of raising these children. She was paid to take them. Vanessa shot to her feet. That's not true. Do you deny receiving the payments? Evelyn asked, turning to her. Vanessa opened her mouth, then closed it. Judge Harrison sighed heavily. Miss Carter, he said, rubbing his temples. You are hereby disqualified from pursuing custody of these children. The courtroom erupted. Liam gripped Lucas's hand tightly. Evelyn closed her eyes, exhaling in relief. It was over. A new beginning. Later that night, Evelyn sat with Liam and Lucas in their new home. She had won. The system had tried to take them, but she had fought harder. Lucas curled up against her side, yawning. Do we get to stay forever? Evelyn kissed the top of his head. Forever, she promised. Liam looked at her. You fought for us. Evelyn's throat tightened. I'd do it again. Liam hesitated, then leaned against her, resting his small head on her shoulder. She had spent years living in silence. But tonight, she listened to the quiet breaths of her two sons, and she knew she had finally come home. A family forged in fire. Evelyn Monroe had spent most of her life believing that the law was absolute, that justice, while imperfect, would always prevail in the end. But after everything, the corruption, the threats, the desperate battle to keep Liam and Lucas safe, she had learned the truth. Justice wasn't given. It had to be fought for, tooth and nail, with every ounce of strength a person had. And for the first time in her life, she had fought not as a judge, but as a mother. Now, the war was over, and it was time to bring her sons home, a decision that couldn't be overturned. The morning light poured through the courtroom windows, casting golden rays across the polished floor. Evelyn stood tall, dressed in her black robes, though today she wasn't behind the bench. She was on the other side, standing before Judge Harrison with Liam and Lucas sitting quietly beside her. Their hands were clasped together, as always. They had been through so much, more than any 5-year-olds ever should. And today, it was finally ending. Judge Harrison cleared his throat, looking over the final papers before him. "Judge Monroe," he said, his deep voice steady, "I have reviewed all documentation regarding the legal guardianship of Liam and Lucas Carter. Given recent events and your long-standing position as a respected officer of the court, I have only one question left to ask." Evelyn held her breath. The judge looked at the twins, his expression softening slightly. "Liam, Lucas, do you want Evelyn Monroe to be your mother?" Lucas didn't hesitate. "Yes," he blurted out, his voice full of conviction. Liam, the more cautious of the two, swallowed hard. He looked up at Evelyn with wide brown eyes, then nodded, gripping her sleeve tightly. "Yeah," he said softly, "we want to stay." Judge Harrison smiled. "Then it's decided." He reached for his pen, signing the last page with a firm stroke. The sound of the stamp sealing the order echoed through the chamber. "It is the ruling of this court," Judge Harrison declared, "that Liam and Lucas Carter are hereby adopted by Judge Evelyn Monroe, effective immediately." For the first time in 15 years, Evelyn Monroe felt whole. Lucas let out a small, excited cheer, bouncing in his seat. Liam didn't make a sound. He just turned and wrapped his arms around Evelyn, pressing his face into her side. She felt his silent relief, his quiet joy, and she knew. She had saved them. But in the process, they had saved her too, a home that finally felt like one. That evening, Evelyn unlocked the front door of her house, letting the twins run ahead of her. For years, this place had felt empty. Too big, too cold. But now, as Liam and Lucas ran from room to room, claiming the space as their own, the house came alive. Lucas darted into the living room, his eyes wide. "Can we put our drawings on the fridge?" Evelyn smiled, shaking her head. "You can cover the whole fridge if you want." Liam stopped in the hallway, his small hand brushing against the wall. "Is this really our home now?" Evelyn knelt down beside him, placing a hand over his. "Yes, sweetheart," she whispered. "This is your home. Forever." Liam nodded once, as if committing the words to memory. Then, with a rare smile, he ran to join his brother. Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment, taking a slow breath. For years, she had filled this house with silence. Now, there was laughter, and she never wanted it to be quiet again. The ghosts of the past. That night, after the boys were tucked into bed, Evelyn found herself standing in front of the hallway closet. Her fingers hovered over the doorknob. She hadn't opened this door in years. Inside was a single box. Samuel's box. The memories hit her like a tidal wave the moment she lifted the lid. Photographs, drawings, a small stuffed bear he had carried everywhere. The last picture she had taken of him sat on top. Her son, smiling at the camera, his golden hair tousled from the wind. She pressed the picture to her chest, closing her eyes. For 15 years, she had kept this grief locked away, terrified that if she let herself feel it, it would drown her. But now, standing in a home filled with the sound of 2 little boys who needed her, she finally understood something. Samuel wouldn't want her to live in the past. He would want her to love again, to be a mother again. And she was. Tears slipped down her cheeks. Not from pain, from peace. She placed the picture back into the box, then carefully shut the lid. But this time, she didn't lock it away. Instead, she carried it to the living room, where Liam and Lucas's drawings already covered the fridge, the coffee table, and the walls. She placed Samuel's box on a nearby shelf. Not hidden, not forgotten, just part of the family. A mother, at last. The next morning, Evelyn woke to the sound of small feet padding into her room. Lucas crawled onto the bed first, his curls messy from sleep. "Mommy, wake up." Liam followed, though he sat more hesitantly at the edge. "Margaret said we're supposed to let you sleep in," he said seriously. Lucas giggled. "But we're hungry." Evelyn groaned dramatically, pulling the covers over her head. So much for peace and quiet. The boys erupted into laughter, jumping onto the bed, wrapping their tiny arms around her. She hugged them back, pulling them close, listening to their laughter fill the room. She had fought tooth and nail for them. She had nearly lost everything for them, and she would do it all over again. Because this was everything. Epilogue. Love defies the law. Months passed. Golden Grove was officially shut down. Leonard Graves resigned in disgrace. Vanessa Carter disappeared from their lives. And Evelyn? She was no longer just a judge. She was a mother. One afternoon, as she was working in her home office, Liam walked in carrying a stack of papers. "We made something for you." Evelyn raised an eyebrow as Lucas climbed onto the chair beside her. "What is it?" Liam carefully placed a drawing in front of her. It was a simple picture. A house, a tall woman with long hair wearing a black robe, and two little boys standing beside her, holding her hands. "Mommy and us." Evelyn broke. Tears welled up in her eyes as she reached out, pulling them both into her arms. She had spent her entire life believing that the law was the highest form of justice. But now she knew the truth. The highest form of justice was love, and she would protect it forever.